The cold was a thief. It crept under the door, through the chinks in the logs, and stole the warmth from the small cabin until the air itself felt brittle, ready to crack. Outside, a world of white was being swallowed by a sky of gray. The sun had given up hours ago, leaving the high valley to the mercy of the coming storm. Inside, Cole was fighting a different kind of cold, a chill that had settled deep in his bones and had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a life that had been hollowed out. His hands, thick and calloused from a lifetime of ranch work, fumbled with a tiny tin scoop and a can of powdered milk. These hands could calm a spooked horse or build a fence line straight as an arrow, but they were clumsy now, defeated. The only sounds in the crushing silence were the hiss of a pot on the stove and the thin, hungry wail of a newborn baby. His son, Samuel. The sound was a nail being hammered into his heart, over and over again, a reminder of everything he had lost, a reminder of his failure. 2 weeks. It had been 2 weeks since he'd buried Eliza, his wife. The woman who had filled this small cabin with laughter was gone, taken by a fever that swept in after the birth. All that was left of her was this tiny, wailing infant, and a grief so big it felt like he was drowning in it. He mixed the formula, his movements slow, heavy. He tested a drop on his wrist like he'd seen her do once. He lifted the crying baby, his own strength feeling like a threat to the fragile bundle. He sat in the rocking chair, the one her grandfather had made, and offered the bottle. The crying stopped. For a moment. A single, blessed moment of peace. Then Samuel turned his head away, his face crumpling, and the wails began again. He wouldn't take it. He never took more than a few sips. The boy was starving, wasting away before his very eyes, and Cole, a man who could wrestle a steer to the ground, was powerless to stop it. He was a rancher who couldn't feed his own son. He was a husband who couldn't save his own wife. He was a man who was failing at the only 2 things that had ever mattered. He looked at the small wooden cross on the wall, the one he and Eliza had hung the day they finished the cabin. Their first act in their new home. A promise. Now it was just a piece of wood, an empty symbol in an empty room. He closed his eyes, the baby's cries echoing in the hollowness of his chest. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. And outside, the wind began to howl. The storm was here. The world outside the window didn't just get dark, it vanished. A swirling white chaos devoured everything. The trees, the barn, the horizon itself. The blizzard wasn't just blowing, it was attacking, throwing its weight against the log walls, making the timbers groan like a dying man. The fire in the stove faltered, shrinking to a few sullen coals that threw trembling shadows on the walls. The cold was winning. Cole didn't move from the rocking chair. He was a statue of grief. The baby, Samuel, had finally exhausted himself into a fitful, shallow sleep. His tiny body was a fragile weight against Cole's chest, a constant, unbearable reminder of his love and his loss. To move was to risk waking the baby, to risk starting the cycle of desperate, hungry cries all over again. So he sat. He stared into the dying embers, watching the last of the warmth, the last of the hope, fade to ash. He was a man shipwrecked on an island of sorrow, and the walls of his home felt like the walls of a tomb. The wind was a monster, shrieking and clawing at the cabin. And then, during a brief, terrifying lull, another sound cut through the roar. A sound so impossible, so out of place, that his exhausted mind couldn't make sense of it at first. It came again, louder this time. A firm, solid pounding on the cabin door. Knock, knock, knock. Cole's blood ran cold. No one could be out in this. The nearest town was a day's ride in good weather. This wasn't a storm for men or beasts. It was the end of the world painted in white. The pounding came a 3rd time, sharper now, more insistent. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. A deep, primal dread began to twist in his gut. This wasn't the fear of an outlaw. It was something older, something darker. In the fog of his grief, It felt like a ghost had come calling, like the storm itself was knocking at his door. He rose slowly, his joints stiff and protesting. He laid the sleeping baby in the cradle, his movements agonizingly deliberate, as if trying to delay the inevitable. He walked to the door, his shadow flickering like a giant on the wall behind him. He took a shaky breath and lifted the heavy iron latch. The metal was so cold it burned his skin. He pulled the door inward. The storm exploded into the room. A furious blast of wind and ice crystals tore through the cabin, instantly snuffing out the dying fire. The single oil lamp on the table sputtered, its flame nearly dying before catching again, casting the room in a weak, wavering light. And in the doorway, framed against the raging blizzard, stood a figure. It was a woman. She was small, wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak, the hood pulled low over her face. She stood her ground against the wind, a small, unmovable rock in a roaring river. A scarf covered her mouth and nose, and her eyelashes were crusted with white frost. For a long second, they just stared at each other, the broken rancher and the specter from the storm. She reached up with a gloved hand and pulled down the scarf. Her face was young, flushed from the cold, but her eyes were what held him. They were a clear, steady hazel, and they burned with a fierce determination that matched the storm itself. Before Cole could speak, before his frozen mind could form a single question, the baby in the cradle let out a whimper. The sound escalated into a thin, desperate wail, cutting through the howl of the wind. The woman's eyes instantly snapped from Cole's face to the cradle. The hardness in her expression melted away, replaced by something else, something primal and deeply compassionate. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply stepped across the threshold, pushing past Cole as if he were a ghost in his own home. She let her snow-covered cloak fall to the floor and moved directly to the cradle. She knelt, her movements sure and practiced, and gathered the wailing infant into her arms. She stood, cradling him close, murmuring soft, soothing words. Then, with her back turned slightly toward Cole, she began to unbutton the top of her dress. Cole stood frozen by the open door, the icy wind forgotten. He watched, bewildered, as his son, the son who had refused the bottle time and time again, turned his head and instinctively rooted against the woman's chest. And then Cole heard it. The most beautiful sound in the world. The soft, rhythmic sound of a hungry baby nursing. The desperate cries stopped, replaced by contented, gulping swallows. A deep, impossible peace settled over the room, so thick it seemed to push the storm itself away. The woman looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his in the dim, flickering light. "The pastor in town. He heard you were in trouble," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "My name is Sadie. I have milk to spare." Cole just stared, his mind reeling. The pastor knew? How could anyone know? And who was this woman, this angel who had walked out of the heart of a blizzard? But then, he saw it. As she shifted the baby in her arms, a small object hanging from a leather cord around her neck swung into the light. It was a locket. A small, silver, heart-shaped locket. Eliza's locket. The world tilted on its axis. Cole finally slammed the door shut, the sound echoing the turmoil in his head. He moved like a man in a dream, coaxing the fire back to life. The flames crackled, slowly pushing back the cold, but they couldn't touch the chill that had seized him. Sadie sat in the rocking chair, Eliza's chair, with his son asleep and content on her shoulder. The scene was a miracle. A terrifying, impossible miracle. He couldn't take his eyes off the locket. It was Eliza's. He'd given it to her himself on their first anniversary. He had buried her with it. He was sure of it. Hadn't he? The grief, the exhaustion. His memory was a fog. But he remembered the feel of the cold metal in his hand as he placed it around her neck one last time. So how was this woman, Sadie, wearing it now? Once the baby was settled in his cradle, sleeping more soundly than Cole had ever seen, The silence in the cabin became a living thing, thick with unspoken questions. Cole knew he had to offer her a place to stay, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. He gestured to a small curtained-off corner. That was Eliza's sewing nook. There's a cot. He kept his voice flat, building a wall between them. You can stay there, for as long as you're needed. Sadie simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Thank you, Cole. She hung her wet cloak by the fire and disappeared behind the curtain without another word. Cole was left alone in the firelight, his mind racing. Was she a thief? A grave robber? Or was something far stranger happening? He felt like a man trapped in a ghost story, haunted not just by the wife he'd lost, but by the woman who had just saved his son. The next few days passed in a strange, tense rhythm. The blizzard blew itself out, leaving the world buried in a silent, glittering blanket of white. Sadie was quiet and efficient. She cared for Samuel with a tenderness that tore at Cole's heart. She fed him, changed him, sang him soft lullabies. The baby thrived under her care, his cheeks filling out, his cries turning to happy gurgles. For Samuel, she was salvation. For Cole, she was a constant, unnerving mystery. He threw himself into the brutal work of the ranch, clearing snow, tending to the half-frozen cattle. The physical exhaustion was a relief, a way to numb the questions that plagued him. They barely spoke. Their conversations were clipped, practical. The water bucket is low. I'll need more firewood. But the silver locket was always there, glinting at her throat, a silent accusation. One evening, he couldn't stand it anymore. Sadie was nursing Samuel by the fire, her head bent over the child. The locket lay against her skin, catching the light. Where did you get that? Cole's voice was rough, harsher than he intended. Sadie looked up, her eyes calm, but a flicker of something, fear, sorrow, passed through them. It was a gift. A gift from who? He pressed, his voice low and dangerous. Eliza gave it to me, she said softly. The lie was so blatant, so impossible, it stole the air from Cole's lungs. That's not possible, he ground out. I buried her with that locket. A slow, sad smile touched Sadie's lips. Did you, Cole? Did you look closely? Or did you just see what your grief wanted you to see? What did she mean? His mind flashed back to that horrible day. The haze of sorrow, the blur of the funeral. He had been so broken. Could he have been mistaken? She saw the confusion on his face. Eliza and we were friends, Sadie continued, her voice gaining strength. Closer than you knew. She wrote to me. She was scared, Cole. Scared of the birth, scared of being so isolated out here. She asked me to come, to be here for her when the baby arrived. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. The storm held me up. I was too late to help her. But I wasn't too late to keep my promise. My promise to look after her son if the worst happened. She reached up and touched the locket. She gave me this the last time I saw her in town. She said if I ever needed to prove who I was, this would do it. She said you would know it. It was too much. A secret friendship? A promise? It felt like another betrayal, another piece of his life with Eliza that had been a lie. He wanted to rage, to call her a liar, to throw her out into the snow. But then he looked at his son, sleeping peacefully, his belly full, a picture of health. This woman, whoever she was, had saved him. He was trapped between suspicion and a desperate, undeniable gratitude. He didn't know what to believe. All he knew was that the ghost of his wife now stood between him and this stranger, and the truth was buried somewhere in the silence. The discovery that Sadie and Eliza had a secret friendship didn't bring peace. It brought more questions. Cole found himself watching Sadie, scrutinizing her every move, searching for cracks in her story. She moved about the cabin with a quiet familiarity, as if she already knew where everything was. One morning, he watched as she reached for a specific chipped mug on the high shelf, Eliza's favorite, without even looking. How could she know that? Had Eliza described his entire life to her in these secret letters? The thought made him feel like a stranger in his own home. He started searching. When Sadie was outside with the baby, he went through the small carpet bag she'd brought with her. His hands felt clumsy and shameful as he rummaged through her few belongings. He found neatly folded clothes, a Bible, and a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. His heart hammered against his ribs. He untied the ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakably Eliza's. He read, his hands shaking. The letters were full of love for him, but also a deep undercurrent of fear and loneliness. She wrote about her health, about feeling weaker than she let on, about a lingering cough she'd hidden from him. She wrote about Sadie, her dearest friend, her rock. And then he read the line that made the floor drop out from under him. Sadie, Eliza had written, you know what it is to lose a child. You are the only one who understands this fear that grips me. Sadie had lost a child. This wasn't just a woman with milk to spare. This was a woman carrying her own bottomless grief. The knowledge changed everything. Her tenderness with Samuel, her fierce determination to get to the cabin, it was all cast in a new, heartbreaking light. He felt a wave of shame for his suspicion, quickly followed by a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Kinship. They were two sides of the same broken coin. He put the letters back, his secret safe for now. That evening, the tension between them shifted. He found himself talking, telling her small things about the ranch, about Samuel. He asked about her family, carefully avoiding the one topic that now burned between them. She answered just as carefully, speaking of her younger brothers, her father. A fragile bridge was being built across a chasm of sorrow. But the past wasn't done with them. A few days later, a rider appeared. It was Pastor Miles, the man Sadie claimed had sent her. He was a kind, elderly man who had presided over Cole and Eliza's wedding and her funeral. He looked relieved to see the cabin standing and the chimney smoking. But when he stepped inside and saw Sadie holding Samuel, a strange expression crossed his face. It wasn't relief. It was a deep, profound sadness. After accepting a cup of coffee, he asked to speak with Cole alone outside. The winter air was sharp. Cole, the pastor began, his voice heavy. I'm glad to see you and the boy are well. Sadie is a good woman, a godsend. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But you must understand, her heart is fragile. She suffered a great tragedy last year. She lost her own baby girl, just a few days old. Cole nodded, pretending this was new information. I know she came here to help, the pastor continued. But she is also here to heal her own wound. Be gentle with her, son. Her grief is as raw as your own. The pastor's words were meant to be a comfort, a plea for compassion, but they planted a new seed of doubt in Cole's mind. Was Sadie's affection for Samuel real? Or was she just using him as a replacement for the child she'd lost? The thought was ugly, but it coiled in the pit of his stomach. He was leaning on her, starting to trust her. But what if he was putting his son in the care of a woman whose heart was broken in a way that could never be truly mended? The pastor's warning hung in the air long after he rode away. Cole watched Sadie through new eyes, eyes clouded with a fresh layer of suspicion. He saw the way she held Samuel, the way she would sometimes just stare at him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Was it a mother's love, or something else? He felt like he was walking a tightrope. On one side was the salvation of his son. On the other was the fear of a woman's desperate, unpredictable grief. One night, he was woken by a sound from the main room. It wasn't Samuel crying. It was a soft, choked weeping. He crept out of his bed and peered through a crack in the curtain that separated his sleeping area. Sadie was standing over the cradle, her back to him. Her shoulders were shaking. He could hear her whispering a name over and over again. But the name she was whispering wasn't Samuel. It was Lily. His blood ran cold. He retreated back into the shadows, his heart pounding. The pastor's words echoed in his head. Her grief is as raw as your own. He had been so consumed by his own loss, he hadn't truly considered the depths of hers. But this was different. This was terrifying. She wasn't just mourning, she was confusing the two children. He looked at his son, sleeping peacefully in the cradle, and a fierce, protective instinct roared to life inside him. He had to protect Samuel. But to do that, he might have to cast out the very woman who was keeping him alive. The cabin, once a shelter, now felt like a cage with two wounded animals, and he didn't know which one was more dangerous. The name Lily echoed in the silence of the cabin for days, an unspoken ghost between them. Cole was torn. Every time he saw Sadie's gentle care for Samuel, his heart ached with gratitude. But every time he remembered her choked sobs in the dead of night, a cold dread washed over him. He started making excuses to keep Samuel close, taking him in a sling as he did his chores in the barn, a clumsy, inefficient process that left him twice as exhausted. Sadie noticed, of course. The hurt in her eyes was a palpable thing, another weight added to the suffocating atmosphere of the small cabin. The breaking point came on a deceptively bright afternoon. The sun on the snow was blinding. Cole was outside splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only outlet for his tangled emotions. He'd left Samuel sleeping in the cradle, thinking Sadie was mending clothes. But when he came back inside, his arms laden with wood, the cradle was empty. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. "Sadie!" he roared, his voice cracking. He burst through the door, his eyes scanning the blinding white landscape. He saw them, a small figure trudging through the deep snow, heading toward the woods at the edge of the property. She was holding the baby. A wild, irrational terror gripped him. Was she running? Was she taking his son? He dropped the wood and sprinted after her, his boots sinking deep into the snow, his lungs burning. He caught up to her at the edge of the tree line, grabbing her arm and spinning her around. "What are you doing?" he yelled, his voice ragged with fear and fury. Samuel, startled by the shouting, began to cry. Sadie looked at him, her face a mask of confusion and hurt. And then he saw it. In her other hand, she held a small, rough cross fashioned from two twigs tied with twine. She followed his gaze down to it, and then back to his face. Her expression crumbled. "There's a small clearing back here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The sun hits it just right in the afternoon. It's where I buried her. My Lily." She looked from the crying baby in her arms to the simple cross. I wanted her to meet him, to know that another baby was safe, to know that some good came from all the pain." Her composure broke completely, and she began to sob, great gut-wrenching sobs of a mother who had lost everything. All the suspicion, all the fear, drained out of Cole in an instant, replaced by a wave of shame so profound it brought him to his knees. He sank into the snow, looking at this broken woman and his crying child. He hadn't been protecting his son from her grief. He had been punishing her for it. They were the same. Both haunted, both shattered, both just trying to find a way to keep breathing. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words inadequate. He reached out not to take the baby, but to steady her arm. "Tell me about her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And so, standing in the snow at the edge of the woods, with his son wailing between them, Sadie told him about Lily, about her dark curls, her tiny hands, the sickness that had taken her in just 3 short days. And as he listened, Cole finally understood. Her love for Samuel wasn't a replacement. It was a testament. A way of honoring the love she still had for the daughter she'd lost. A fragile truce settled over the cabin. The ghosts were still there, but now they had names. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but with a shared, unspoken understanding. They began to talk, really talk. He told her about Eliza, about his guilt over not seeing how sick she was. She told him about her own guilt, the endless what-ifs that plagued a grieving parent. They were two lonely people in a vast, empty wilderness, finding a strange and unexpected solace in each other's scars. But the world outside the valley was not as quiet. One day, a wagon pulled up to the cabin. A man, dressed in a fine city coat that looked completely out of place, stepped down. He was tall, with a hard face and cold, assessing eyes. Cole recognized him instantly, and his heart sank. It was Arthur Vance, Eliza's older brother, a man who had always looked down on Cole, who thought his sister had married beneath her. Arthur's eyes swept over the small cabin with disdain before landing on Sadie, who was standing in the doorway holding Samuel, his lip curled into a sneer. "So, the rumors are true," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've already replaced my sister, and with her." He spat the word, looking at Sadie as if she were something he'd scraped off his boot. "Arthur," Cole said, stepping forward, his voice low and steady. "This is not the time." "Oh, I think it is," Arthur shot back, his eyes glinting with malice. "I've heard all about this woman in town. A woman who lost her own child. A woman who whispers another baby's name over my nephew's cradle. I've come to take the boy. I have a court order that names me his legal guardian. You are an unfit father, and this is an unhealthy environment. He's coming with me." He held up a piece of paper, the official seal glinting in the harsh sunlight. It was a weapon, and he was pointing it straight at Cole's heart. The court order was a death sentence. Cole stared at the paper in Arthur's hand, the legal jargon swimming before his eyes. Unfit father. Unhealthy environment. The words were a brand, searing into his soul. Arthur had money, influence. Cole was just a rancher with dirt under his nails and a reputation now stained by tragedy and gossip. He had no chance. "You can't," Cole said, his voice hollow. "He's my son." "He is my blood," Arthur countered, his voice like flint. "And I will not see him raised in a shack in the middle of nowhere by a broken man and a mad woman." He took a step toward the cabin, his eyes fixed on Samuel. Sadie instinctively pulled the baby tighter, her body a shield. Cole moved to stand in front of them, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. "You will not take him," Sadie said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength that surprised them both. "You know nothing of this home. You know nothing of love or loss." Arthur laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I know that my sister is dead. I know that you were the woman he was courting before he met her. It's all quite convenient, isn't it? The grieving widow and the old flame, playing house with my nephew as their pawn." The accusation was vile, designed to poison and destroy. Cole felt a surge of white-hot rage, but before he could act on it, Sadie spoke again. "Your sister was my friend," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And she knew. She knew this day might come." She turned and went back into the cabin. A moment later, she returned. She was holding the small bundle of Eliza's letters. She walked right up to Arthur and held them out. "She wrote these. She wanted Cole to have them. I believe you should read one first." She selected one from the pile and handed it to him. Arthur snatched it from her hand, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He unfolded the paper and began to read. As his eyes moved across the page, the sneer on his face slowly vanished. The color drained from his cheeks. The letter was Eliza's last. Her handwriting was weak, spidery, but the words were clear. She wrote of her love for Cole, of her fear for her own failing health, a sickness she had hidden from everyone. She wrote of her brother's arrogance and his obsession with appearances, And then came the final devastating lines. "If anything should happen to me," Eliza wrote, "I know Arthur will try to take my son. He sees him as a Vance, not a child to be loved. Do not let him. My only peace is in knowing that Sadie will be there. She is the only one I trust to help Cole raise my boy with love, not with pride. She is family." The letter was a ghost's final wish, a voice from the grave that dismantled Arthur's entire case. He looked up from the paper, his face ashen. He stared at Cole, at Sadie, at the baby, and for the first time, he looked not like a villain, but like a man who had been utterly and completely defeated. He crumpled the letter in his fist. Without another word, he turned, climbed back into his wagon, and rode away, leaving the court order lying in the snow like a fallen leaf. The threat was gone. Vanquished not by fists or by law, but by the truth, spoken in a dead woman's hand. Cole looked at Sadie, who stood watching the wagon disappear, the remaining letters clutched in her hand. The sunlight caught the tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. He had seen her as a mystery, a threat, a fellow mourner. Now he saw her for what she truly was, a guardian, a keeper of promises, the woman his wife had trusted to save them all. In the quiet that followed, standing there in the snow, he finally understood. His life hadn't ended when Eliza died. It had just been broken open, waiting for something, or someone, to make it whole again. He looked at Sadie, really looked at her, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled away. It wasn't just gratitude he felt. It was something deeper, something that had been quietly growing in the spaces between their shared griefs. It was a fragile, terrifying, and undeniable hope. It was love. The seasons turned, the snow melted, feeding the creeks that ran through the valley. The world turned from white to green. The cabin, once a place of sorrow, was now filled with the sounds of life. Samuel's happy babbling, the sizzle of bacon in a pan, the soft hum of Sadie's lullabies. The home was no longer haunted. It was blessed. Cole and Sadie worked side by side, rebuilding not just the ranch after the harsh winter, but their own lives. They moved in a comfortable rhythm, a partnership forged in the fire of shared loss and tempered by a quiet, growing affection. The past was a part of them, but it no longer defined them. The ghosts of Eliza and Lily were still there, but they were gentle presences now, memories to be honored, not sorrows to be feared. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Cole knew the time had come. Samuel was asleep in his cradle. Sadie was sitting in the rocking chair, mending a tear in one of Cole's shirts, the firelight dancing in her hair. He walked over and stood before her, his heart pounding in his chest. She looked up, her hazel eyes questioning. "Sadie," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "You walked into this cabin in the middle of the worst storm of my life. You saved my son. You saved me. You brought this place, and me, back to life." He took a deep breath. "I know the man I was. I was a fool to let you go all those years ago. I won't make that mistake again." He reached down and took her hand, the one holding the needle. "Eliza brought us together. But this, what's grown between us, this is ours. I love you, Sadie, not as a ghost of the past, but as the hope for my future. Will you marry me? Will you help me make this a real family?" Tears welled in Sadie's eyes, shimmering in the firelight. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Cole," she whispered, her voice thick, "my heart has been home since the day I walked through that door." She stood and put her arms around his neck. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding wasn't a grand affair. It was held in the small white church at the edge of town, the same church where Cole had buried one life and now began another. The whole town came, their faces filled with a joy that was deep and true. They had all witnessed the miracle. They had seen a broken man made whole. They had seen a family born not of convenience, but of profound, hard-won love. Years passed. The ranch flourished. The cabin was filled with the laughter of more children, a noisy, happy testament to their new life. One warm summer evening, Cole sat on the porch, watching Sadie play with their children in the yard as the fireflies began to blink in the twilight. He thought back to that desperate man in the blizzard, a man so lost he couldn't even pray. He had been given a second chance, a life more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. Their story wasn't one of perfection, but of redemption. It was a story of how the deepest winter can give way to the most glorious spring. It was a promise that began with a knock on the door in the middle of a storm. If this story of faith, forgiveness, and second chances touched your heart, don't forget that even in the darkest storms, hope can arrive in the most unexpected ways. To hear more stories that remind us of the strength of the human spirit and the power of love, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.